Welcome back to The Explainer. So today, we are tackling a giant. We're going to demystify one of history's most notoriously complex and, honestly, arguably most misunderstood philosophers of all time, G.W.F. Hegel. And yes, I know, his books are basically impossible to read, but his ideas? His ideas are absolutely brilliant. I mean, if you've ever looked at the sheer volume of human history and thought, is this all just random chaos, or is there an actual point to the whole shebang? Well, you are already asking a profoundly Hegelian question. By unpacking his vision of reality today, I promise you it's going to be an absolutely fascinating ride.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start by asking if history actually has a plot. Then, we'll map out the engine of dialectics, look at the cunning of reason, chart the progress of freedom, and finally, wrap up with his legacy and modern critics. It's a massive topic, but we've got it broken down into a clear, logical journey, so let's take it step by step.
All right, Section 1, Making Sense of History. Is there a plot?
So, to really get into this, we first need to ask if human history is just a random, endless series of chaotic events, wars, empires rising and falling, random accidents, or does it have an actual intelligible direction? There's a pretty stark contrast here. On the one hand, you have the ultimate cynical view of existence, famously summed up by Shakespeare's Macbeth. He says life and history are just a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury signifying nothing. The novelist Dostoevsky actually had a pretty similar take. He basically said you can call history almost anything except rational. But then, on the complete flip side, you have Hegel's radical optimism. Hegel declares, the rational is the real, and the real is the rational. For him, reason isn't just something we cook up in our heads, it is literally woven into the very fabric of reality itself. History isn't just a string of meaningless accidents, it's entirely rational, and it is deeply purposeful.
But okay, to understand how history can be purposeful, we have to grasp this one absolutely crucial concept, Geist. Now this translates from German roughly as spirit or mind, but, and this is a big but, you really shouldn't think of Geist as some static, unchanging God just hanging out outside the universe. Instead, Geist is reality itself. It's reality in the active process of becoming fully self-aware. For Hegel, this absolute spirit uses everything, nature, art, religion, and especially our finite human minds, as a grand stage to discover its own nature.
So here is the real kicker. History is the story of absolute spirit's self-unfolding. Because spirit is realizing itself over time, history isn't just, record-keeping or a giant filing cabinet of past events. It is a profoundly teleological journey. And teleological just means it has a destination. It has a final goal. We as human beings are the active participants in spirit coming to actually know itself.
Section 2. The Engine of Dialectics. How change actually happens.
Now, if history is moving forward, there obviously has to be some kind of hidden engine driving that change, right? For Hegel, that fuel is conflict and contradiction. But before we get into what Hegel's dialectic actually is, we really need to bust a massive historical myth. If you know a bit about Hegel, you've probably heard the classic formula thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Well, here's some insider knowledge for you. Hegel basically never used those terms. Seriously, this rigid three-step formula was actually popularized by other philosophers like Fichte and a guy named Heinrich Maurice Charlebaeus. Later on, Karl Marx took this exact rigid machinery and superimposed it onto his own theories of economic movements. But applying that to Hegel is a massive, almost brutal simplification of his actual thought process.
To understand the real engine driving Hegel's philosophy, we need to look at this very specific German word, Aufheben, or sublation. It's a brilliant term because it has a doubled, almost contradictory meaning. It means to cancel or negate something, but at the exact same time, to preserve it. In Hegel's view, as history or ideas progress, higher concepts don't just completely destroy the old ones. No, they overgrasp them. They build out of earlier determinations, preserving what was true and valuable while canceling out their limitations.
So here is how this actually works in Hegel's method. It happens in three fluid moments. First, you have the moment of understanding. This is when an idea, or say a political system, seems completely fixed and stable. But then inevitably comes the dialectical moment. The idea's own internal flaws and one-sidedness start coming to the surface, creating serious instability. It naturally destabilizes and literally passes into its opposite. It self-sublates. Finally, we reach the speculative moment. This is where we grasp the unity of that opposition. We arrive at a richer, much more universal truth that encompasses the previous stages.
And this brilliantly illustrates why Hegel breaks away from ancient thinkers like Plato. Plato thought universal truths were totally static, existing in some separate, perfect realm because the real physical world was just too messy. But Hegel says, no, the world is messy. It's inherently dialectical, which means human reason itself must be dynamic, messy, and dialectical to actually understand it. A dialectical reason can overgrasp a dialectical world. Moving right along to Section 3, the cunning of reason, the invisible hand steering the wheel.
So, if reason is this dynamic force pushing history forward, how does the absolute spirit actually maneuver real, everyday human beings to achieve its grand design? Well, just let the starkness of this imagery sink in for a second. Hegel famously, and kind of darkly, described history as a slaughter bench on which the happiness of peoples and the virtue of individuals have been sacrificed. Yeah, he wasn't naive about the horrors of the past at all. He explicitly stated that history is not the soil in which happiness grows. The march of the absolute spirit absolutely does not pause for individual suffering.
But how does it actually do this? Hegel called this mechanism the cunning of reason, or List der Vernunft. You see, absolute spirit has an ultimate design, to achieve consciousness of its own total freedom. But it actually accomplishes this by using the selfish passions and ambitions of everyday people. And this brilliantly illustrates how reason is so incredibly cunning. It lets individuals do all its dirty work for it. Think about those huge world historical individuals, people like Julius Caesar or Napoleon. They act out of massive personal ambition and ego, but unwittingly, they're actually serving as the instruments that smash down old stagnant systems, advancing the larger purposes of the world spirit. They usually pay the ultimate price, sacrificing themselves to their passions. But reason? Reason just keeps marching on.
Which leads us to Section 4, the progress of freedom, mapping the historical timeline.
Let's look at what this march of reason actually looks like when applied to the rise and fall of human civilizations. Mapping history geographically from east to west, Hegel created this timeline showing the irreversible expansion of human freedom. Now, it is super important to note that modern scholars rightfully point out the strong Eurocentric bias in this historical model, but for the sake of understanding him, here is exactly how Hegel structured it. In the ancient Eastern world, which he called the Oriental world, there was despotism. This meant only one person, the ruler, was truly free. Then, history moves forward to the Greek and Roman world, where some were free. You had free citizens, sure, but this freedom rested on the backs of large enslaved populations. Finally, he believed the realization that all humans are inherently free emerged in the Germanic nations, following the rise of Christianity.
For Hegel, all of this culminated in the modern constitutional state of his era. Now, neutrally looking at his argument, he viewed constitutional monarchy not as some form of oppression, but as the ultimate dialectical synthesis. It essentially took the top-down order and unity of ancient despotism, combined it with the individual freedom of volatile direct democracy, and stabilized the whole thing within a highly rational legal framework. But here's the thing. Hegel also knew you can't just predict the future. He wrote this incredibly beautiful poetic metaphor. The owl of Minerva begins its flight only with the onset of dusk. Now, Minerva is the Roman goddess of wisdom. What he means here is that philosophy and true understanding can only truly grasp a historical era after that era has already matured and begun to pass away. It's like we can only understand the rationality of history by looking backwards at it in the rearview mirror.
All right, our final section, Section 5, Legacy and Modern Critics. Who hijacked the vehicle?
Hegel's towering ideas were almost immediately picked up, debated, and frankly, hijacked to birth massive opposing philosophical movements. The most famous response to Hegel came from a guy you've definitely heard of, Karl Marx. Marx looked at Hegel's brilliant dialectical engine, that whole idea of conflict driving history forward, and he kept it. He thought it was great. But he literally turned Hegel's philosophy on its head. Marx completely rejected the idealist notion of some absolute spirit driving things behind the scenes. Instead, he swapped it out for raw materialism. For Marx, it wasn't the unfolding of a spiritual idea, it was the conflict between social classes and material economic conditions that actually forced history forward.
And the debates certainly didn't stop with Marx. Hegel's legacy is just incredibly diverse. First off, as we mentioned, his Eurocentric bias and rank ordering of civilizations are widely critiqued today as highly problematic, and understandably so. Yet at the exact same time, some modern post-colonial scholars actually use Hegel's core concepts of freedom and building, which means education and self-realization, to argue for the necessary liberation of colonized peoples. They're essentially pushing his ideas of inclusive freedom way further than he ever did himself. Then, on a totally different end of the political spectrum, political scientist Francis Fukuyama famously drew on Hegelian ideas to declare that the triumph of Western liberal democracy might actually represent the end of history, the final dialectical synthesis.
So, what does this all mean for us? Why does all of this matter for you, the focused learner, today? Well, despite all the legitimate criticisms, Hegel fundamentally reshapes how we read the past. Learning to think with Hegel really sharpens our ability to find meaning in the chaos of modern political events. It literally forces us to stop looking at the news as just random, depressing noise and instead ask the big questions. Is there an underlying logic here? Is human freedom actually expanding over the long run, even through all this crazy conflict?
I want to leave you with this final, provocative question. Look around at the messy, chaotic reality of the world today. Have we reached the grand, rational synthesis Hegel envisioned? Has the absolute spirit reached the end of history? Or is our current reality just another momentary thesis, filled with contradictions, just waiting to be sublated into a new dialectical moment? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. And honestly, I hope it completely changes the way you look at the history happening all around you.